Marcos had been driving through the endless desert for hours, his car rattling on the cracked road, headlights barely cutting through the thick, dusty air. He'd lost cell service long ago, and now the temperature was plummeting as night closed in around him, swallowing any trace of direction. Exhausted, he scanned the horizon for any sign of life, his eyes straining in the darkness. And then, as if conjured from his deepest need, a glimmer appeared, a building bathed in a faint yellow light, standing alone among the dunes. As he drew closer, the structure materialized into a hotel, its walls a pale, weathered gray that looked as if they had withstood centuries of sandstorms. The sign above the door flickered faintly, casting intermittent shadows across the ground, and the faint outline of the words Desert Haven was barely visible, covered in layers of sand and time. Marcos couldn't shake the feeling that the place was waiting for him, that somehow his arrival was anticipated. He stepped out of his car, feeling the cold night air bite at his skin. Silence engulfed him, an oppressive stillness so deep that it felt like the desert itself was holding its breath. Every instinct screamed for him to leave, but the pull of shelter, of rest, was overpowering. The sand shifted beneath his feet as he approached the entrance, a whispering sound that seemed almost alive, as if the desert were reaching out, trying to swallow his footsteps. Marcos pushed open the heavy, creaking door, and a wave of stale air rushed out to meet him, thick with an earthy, decaying scent. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb that swayed slightly, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. The furniture looked ancient, draped in a fine layer of dust, as though untouched for decades. To his left, a reception desk sat in eerie silence, a rusty bell sitting on the counter. Above it, a row of keys hung, each one labeled with a room number, each room seemingly vacant. But one key, labeled with his name, lay alone on the counter, its tarnished metal glinting in the faint light. His blood ran cold. How could they know he would be here? He glanced around, his pulse pounding in his ears, but there was no sign of anyone else, no receptionist, no other guests. The quiet was unnerving, thick and unnatural, like a place abandoned, yet still somehow filled with a hidden, watchful presence. As he took the key in his trembling hand, he noticed a mirror on the wall behind the counter. In its cracked surface, his reflection appeared distorted, eyes darkened, as if something in the mirror were staring back at him, something lurking just beneath the surface of his own image. He felt a chill creep down his spine, a creeping sense of wrongness he couldn't shake, and the shadows in the mirror seemed to deepen, forming vague, ghostly figures that vanished when he looked closer. A faint sound echoed from somewhere deep within the hotel, a soft rhythmic tapping, like footsteps, or perhaps the sound of something clawing through sand. It was coming from the hallway that led to his room. The air felt heavier with each step, and he could almost swear that the walls were breathing, expanding and contracting with a slow, unsettling rhythm. Each door he passed seemed to watch him, the numbers faded, the wood scarred with deep gouges, as if someone, or something, had tried desperately to escape. When he reached his room, he fumbled with the key, hands trembling as the lock clicked open. The door creaked, revealing a room draped in shadows, illuminated only by the weak glow of a small, flickering lamp on the bedside table. The wallpaper was peeling, the bed neatly made, but covered in a thin layer of dust. A musty smell filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of something metallic, like old blood. Marcos hesitated at the threshold, his instinct screaming at him to turn and leave. But as he stepped inside, something caught his eye. A small object on the bedside table. It was a weathered, old keychain in the shape of a star. His heart sank. He recognized it instantly. It was identical to the one his mother had given him as a child, the one he'd thought lost forever. He reached out to touch it, his hand shaking, and the moment his fingers brushed against it, a low, haunting melody began to drift through the room. The tune was eerily familiar, the same lullaby his mother had sung to him as a boy, each note echoing like a whisper from a distant memory. Marcos's skin prickled with fear, the sensation of being watched pressing down on him. He turned, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but the room was empty. Only silence remained, thick and suffocating, yet that strange, unsettling lullaby continued, filling the air with a dreadful sense of foreboding. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker, as if the hotel itself were alive, feeding off his fear, preparing to consume him whole. Marco sat on the edge of the dusty bed, staring at the old keychain in his hand, its tarnished metal glinting faintly in the dim light. The lullaby still echoed softly around him, each haunting note pressing against his mind like a fog he couldn't shake. He could feel the weight of something familiar, yet deeply unsettling, an ancient memory stirring just beyond reach. Closing his eyes, he tried to focus, to remember why this simple object and its melody evoked such a sense of dread. Suddenly, fragments of a long-forgotten memory emerged. A hot summer night, the air heavy with the scent of desert sands, and his mother's soft voice, weaving that same melody into the night as they sat under a blanket of stars. She had spoken of the desert's hidden dangers, her voice low and cautious, warning him of places where reality blurred and travelers vanished, taken by the sand itself. Marcos remembered the fear in her eyes, her hand gripping his a little too tightly as she spoke, her voice trembling with a fear she never fully explained. As the memory faded, Marcos opened his eyes, his heart racing as he realized that this hotel might be one of those places his mother had spoken of, a place that didn't obey the natural order, where shadows lived and sand swallowed secrets. He glanced around, the room closing in on him, the walls seeming to pulse with a life of their own. The lullaby had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence, thick and expectant. It felt as though the room were listening, waiting for something for him. His gaze drifted toward the cracked mirror hanging on the opposite wall. He hadn't noticed it before, but now, as he looked closer, something caught his eye. Etched faintly into the glass was a word, scrawled in shaky, desperate handwriting. Remember. Marcos's pulse quickened as he approached the mirror, his reflection distorted, his eyes hollow and dark as he stared at the ghostly letters. Beneath the word, he noticed faint, uneven lines as if someone had scratched the surface in a frantic attempt to communicate before disappearing. The air in the room grew colder, a biting chill that seeped through his clothes and into his bones. He shivered, feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him, watching his every move. A soft whisper seemed to float through the room, an unintelligible murmur that sounded almost like his mother's voice, beckoning him to remember. But remember what? A sense of unease filled him, a gnawing feeling that something terrible had happened here, something connected to him, to his past, and to this desolate place. Just then, a sharp pain shot through his left hand. He looked down to find a scar he hadn't noticed before, a faint line across his palm, pale and old, but now throbbing with a deep, insistent ache. He didn't remember getting this scar. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. Yet, it felt strangely familiar, like an old wound reopened by his very presence in this room. The pain intensified, radiating up his arm, and as he stared at the scar, he was hit by another flash of memory. He was a young boy, wandering alone in a darkened desert, the night air heavy and thick with fear. The sand was cold beneath his feet, shifting as if it were alive, and he had stumbled, falling onto something sharp that sliced into his hand. He remembered crying out, the sting of blood and sand mixing, and then a figure appearing, a shadowy shape in the darkness, reaching out to him with fingers made of smoke and whispers. He had tried to run, but the figure had followed, its laughter soft and menacing, echoing through the desert night. As the memory faded, he looked back at the mirror, his scar still throbbing. The word remember glowed faintly on the glass, as if urging him to confront something long buried in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that this scar, this hotel, and the figure from his memory were all connected, bound by a dark thread woven through the fabric of his past. The air grew colder, the shadows in the room deepening, as if they were feeding off his fear, growing stronger with every frightened breath he took. The walls seemed to close in, the wallpaper peeling back to reveal a darkness beneath, an endless void that pulsed and breathed, as if alive. And then he heard it, a distant sound, faint at first, but growing louder with each second. It was a lullaby again, but this time it sounded different, warped and twisted, like a child's cry mixed with the desert wind. The song clawed at his mind, bringing forth images of lost travelers and hollow-eyed shadows, faces frozen in terror as they vanished into the sands, never to be seen again. Marcos stumbled back, clutching his head as the memories surged, fragments of forgotten nightmares flooding his thoughts. He remembered more now, a journey he'd taken as a child, lost in the desert with his mother, stumbling upon a place that should not exist. A place much like this hotel, a place where the sand moved with a life of its own, swallowing anything or anyone who dared to linger too long. He remembered her frantic whispers, her warnings to never look back, to always keep moving, to never listen to the voices in the sand. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that he had ignored her warnings, that by staying in this room, he had invited something old and hungry back into his life. The mirror's reflection shifted, the faint outline of a shadowy figure appearing behind him, its face twisted in a malevolent grin, its eyes hollow and endless. He turned quickly, but the room was empty, just the stillness, the darkness, and the oppressive silence that now felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in, preparing to devour him whole. The silence in the room pressed down on Marcos, a stifling weight that made it hard to breathe. He felt trapped, as though the walls themselves were closing in, watching him, feeding off his fear. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, lingering just beyond the faint glow of the flickering bedside lamp, daring him to step into their embrace. Every instinct screamed for him to leave, to run out into the desert and never look back. But he knew, somehow, that leaving was no longer an option. He was entangled in the web of this place, bound to it by threads of fear and memories he couldn't fully recall. Suddenly, a faint sound broke the silence, a low whisper, like a breathy chant drifting from the hallway. The voice was soft, almost coaxing, calling his name with a familiarity that made his skin crawl. Marcos felt an icy chill run through him as he approached the door, hands shaking as he reached for the knob. He hesitated, heart pounding, every instinct warning him against it, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent, as if it were daring him to open the door, to face whatever horror waited on the other side. As the door creaked open, he was met by the dimly lit corridor stretching into darkness. The air was thick with a cloying scent, a mix of decay and something ancient, something that shouldn't exist in the realm of the living. At the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the gloom, stood a figure, an indistinct silhouette cloaked in shadows, its face obscured, but its eyes glowing faintly, two pinpoints of eerie, unnatural light. The figure raised a hand, beckoning him forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring its prey. Marcos took a step back, terror clawing at his throat, but the whisper continued, low and melodic, filling his mind with fragments of memories and promises of rest. Yet there was something more behind the voice, a weight of malice, an ancient hunger. He knew in the pit of his stomach that this figure held power over him, a force woven into the very fabric of this place. And then the whisper shifted, urging him with a single, chilling command, choose. The word echoed in his mind, rattling his thoughts, filling him with dread. He felt the weight of the choice settling over him, an impossible decision that seemed to have no answer, no escape. As he stood there, frozen in fear, images flashed before his eyes, a memory of his mother's face, her eyes wide with terror, her voice a frantic whisper as she had begged him to promise he'd never come back to places like this. He remembered her words, her warnings about the dangers lurking in forgotten places, shadows that clung to the soul and fed off regret. The figure at the end of the hallway beckoned again, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Marcos felt his legs move involuntarily, drawn toward the creature like a moth to a flame. His mind raced, desperate for a way out, but the figure's voice cut through his thoughts, offering him an ultimatum that chilled him to the core. He could leave, but only if he left something precious behind. The choice was clear yet agonizing. Either surrender his most cherished memory, or remain trapped in this twisted place, forever haunted by the things lurking in the shadows. The realization struck him like a punch to the chest. To escape, he would have to let go of his last memory of his mother, the image of her face, her voice, her warnings, the very core of who he was. He felt a pang of despair as he understood that the hotel was demanding a part of him, a piece of his soul that he would never regain. The memory burned brightly in his mind, vivid and warm, a beacon of light against the darkness threatening to consume him. How could he let that go? How could he erase the last trace of her presence, the one thing that had kept him grounded all these years? Yet the figure stood there, waiting, its gaze unwavering, its outstretched hand promising freedom, but at an unbearable price. Marcos's hands shook, his chest tight with grief and fear. He looked back at his room, at the keychain on the table, the symbol of a past he was being asked to abandon. He could almost hear his mother's voice, her lullaby faintly drifting through the corridor, a soothing balm that he knew he'd lose forever if he made the choice to leave. As he stared into the figure's hollow, glowing eyes, a sense of resignation settled over him. He knew he couldn't stay. This place was devouring him, slowly stripping him of his sanity. The shadows crept closer, reaching for him, hungry tendrils of darkness eager to claim him if he wavered for even a second. He had no choice. With a trembling breath, he nodded, surrendering to the hotel's demands, feeling the memory begin to slip away like grains of sand slipping through his fingers. A wave of cold washed over him as he felt the memory being torn from his mind, the warmth of his mother's face, her voice, her touch fading into a hollow emptiness. The figure's eyes gleamed brighter, almost triumphant, as the memory was devoured, leaving a void in his soul that he could never fill. He felt numb, hollow, a stranger within his own mind, the last tether to his past severed in a place that had no mercy, no remorse. As the figure retreated into the darkness, its whispers fading, Marcos stumbled back, barely able to stand, his body drained and weak. The hallway stretched on, empty and silent, the oppressive weight lifting slightly as he felt the faintest hint of freedom. But the cost lingered, a wound that would never heal, a scar carved into his very being by the choice he had been forced to make. With the memory of his mother lost, Marcos felt a strange detachment, as if he were fading along with her, a part of him forever bound to the darkness of the hotel. The corridor began to dissolve, the walls melting into shadows, leaving him alone in the vast, empty desert, a traveler who had lost not just his way, but a piece of his soul, devoured by the impossible choice that haunted him even as he stumbled free. Marcos's steps echoed through the darkened hallway as he left his room, the emptiness pressing down on him with an oppressive weight. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to escape the hotel's grasp, but the further he walked, the more he felt an unnatural presence closing in. The air was thick with silence, an eerie stillness that felt alive, watching him, waiting. Shadows clung to the walls, shifting in ways that defied the faint, flickering lights. He glanced back, half expecting to see something following, but the hallway remained empty, at least to the naked eye. But then, just as he was about to turn away, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper drifting through the air. The voice was low and hushed, barely more than a breath, yet it clawed at his mind, filling him with a bone-deep dread. The words were garbled, lost to the void of darkness, but the tone was unmistakable, a warning, a plea, or perhaps a curse. Marcos froze, heart pounding as he strained to hear, his mind grasping at the fragments of sound. The whisper seemed to rise and fall, like something ancient and mournful, a sound that felt older than the walls around him. The whispering grew louder, echoing down the corridor, and Marcos realized with horror that it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, a multitude of hushed voices weaving together, creating a symphony of despair and dread. They seemed to come from the very walls, as if the building itself were alive, a haunted vessel filled with the echoes of those who had been trapped there before him. The voices were growing stronger, more urgent, calling his name in a twisted, dissonant melody that sent chills racing down his spine. He backed away, the shadows seeming to close in, their dark tendrils stretching across the floor, almost as if they were reaching for him. He felt a cold, invisible hand brush against his shoulder, and he spun around, but there was nothing, just the endless hallway, stretching into darkness. His skin prickled with fear, the sensation of being watched intensifying with every step he took. The whispers grew louder, their voices merging into a low, mournful chant, filling his mind with images he didn't understand, flashes of faces, hollow-eyed and gaunt, twisted in expressions of terror. The air around him grew colder, and his breath puffed out in small, visible clouds as he walked, each step feeling like it took him deeper into a place that defied reality. The walls seemed to shift, warping in his peripheral vision, as if the hotel itself were alive, twisting and reshaping to trap him within its dark, claustrophobic maze. And then, he felt it again, a soft, gentle breath against his ear, warm and unsettling, a whisper that seemed far too close. "Do you remember?" the voice hissed, a question that burrowed into his mind, festering like an open wound. He felt his pulse quicken as fragments of his lost memory flickered in his thoughts. The sound of his mother's voice, the touch of her hand, her warnings about the dangers of wandering too far into the unknown. But each time he tried to grasp the memory, it slipped away, fading into the dark recesses of his mind. The shadows seemed to feed off his frustration, growing darker, denser, their whispers mocking him, taunting him with the knowledge he had lost. Marcos's eyes darted around the corridor, every shadow seeming to take shape, forming faces twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. They stared at him with hollow eyes, accusing, pleading, as if demanding that he join them. His breath came in shallow gasps, his skin crawling with the sensation of fingers brushing against him, cold and clammy, pulling him into their eternal darkness. He stumbled back, pressing himself against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest as the voices continued, louder, insistent. He felt as if he were drowning in their despair, the weight of the whispers pressing against his mind, filling him with a terror he couldn't escape. The darkness around him seemed to pulse, alive and hungry, a void that wanted to consume him whole. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the whispers, but they only grew louder, invading his thoughts, turning his memories into a distorted nightmare. He saw flashes of his past, twisted and wrong, his mother's face contorted in terror, her voice no longer gentle, but filled with a sinister, mocking tone. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer alone. The shadows had taken form, figures made of darkness and despair, their faces obscured, but their eyes glowing with a faint, ghostly light. They surrounded him, silent now, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He could feel their hatred, their jealousy, as if they resented him for still being alive, for having the chance to escape. One figure stepped closer, its form flickering in and out of focus, like a memory half remembered, a nightmare he couldn't fully recall. It reached out a hand, long and skeletal, the fingers twisting and curling, as if beckoning him to join them. Marcos wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move, paralyzed by fear and the weight of the shadows pressing down on him. The figure leaned close, its breath cold against his skin, and whispered in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves, "There's no escape. You belong to us now." The words echoed in his mind, a final, chilling promise that filled him with a dread so profound it felt like his soul was being ripped apart. He felt the shadows creeping closer, merging with him, seeping into his skin, filling him with their darkness. His own shadow twisted on the wall, contorting into unnatural shapes, as if trying to break free, to flee the darkness that now claimed him. The voices grew louder, a cacophony of despair and hatred, a relentless tide that threatened to drown him in their sorrow. And just as he thought he would be consumed, he heard a faint, distant sound, the lullaby, his mother's lullaby, drifting through the darkness. The melody was fragile, like a thread of light in the void, pulling him back, grounding him. The shadows recoiled, hissing, their forms losing shape, dissolving into the darkness as the lullaby grew stronger, pushing back the oppressive weight. Marcos took a shuddering breath, his body trembling as he clung to the sound, his last connection to the world outside this nightmare. But as the lullaby faded, the darkness returned, settling over him like a shroud. He was alone again, the hallway empty, silent, yet the memory of the shadows lingered, a reminder that he was not safe, that he could never truly escape. The whispers had left their mark, a darkness that clung to his soul, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that they would be waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to reclaim him the moment he let his guard down. Marcos stumbled through the dimly lit corridors of the hotel, each step echoing ominously against the cracked tiles beneath his feet. The walls around him seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in sync with his ragged breaths. His vision blurred at the edges, shadows twisting into grotesque shapes that slithered just beyond his line of sight. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint whisper of the desert wind seeping through unseen cracks, carrying with it ghostly murmurs that gnawed at his sanity. As he moved deeper into the labyrinthine passages, the boundaries between reality and illusion began to dissolve. He glanced at a faded portrait hanging crookedly on the wall, only to see the eyes of the figure within follow him, a sinister grin spreading across its face. Startled, he turned away, but the images grew more disturbing. The patterned wallpaper started to writhe, the floral designs morphing into serpents that coiled and hissed, their scales shimmering with a lifelike sheen. Marcos's heart pounded in his chest as a cold sweat slicked his skin. He could hear his mother's lullaby again, but now it was distorted, the sweet melody warped into a dissonant dirge that echoed through the empty halls. The floor beneath him shifted, feeling more like shifting sands than solid ground. He stumbled, reaching out to steady himself against the wall, but recoiled as the surface felt moist and pulsed under his touch, as if alive. Panic surged within him as he realized he was losing his grip on reality. Visions assaulted him. Flashbacks of being lost in the desert as a child, the relentless sun beating down, the sands swallowing his footsteps. But now, the desert was inside the hotel, its dunes rising around him, grains of sand cascading from the ceiling like a suffocating hourglass counting down his remaining time. He could feel the sand filling his shoes, pulling him down, anchoring him in place. Voices began to whisper from the shadows, indistinct at first, but growing clearer. They called his name, each one a sibilant hiss that sent chills racing down his spine. Faces emerged from the darkness, distorted visages of past travelers, their eyes hollow, mouths agape in silent screams. They reached out with skeletal hands, fingers grasping at the air, desperate to drag him into their eternal torment. Marcos tried to run, but the hallway stretched endlessly before him, the exit perpetually out of reach. Doors on either side of him slammed open and shut of their own accord, revealing glimpses of nightmarish scenes within. In one room, he saw himself trapped, pounding on the windows as the room filled with sand. In another, he witnessed his own reflection laughing maniacally, eyes glowing with a malevolent light. His senses betrayed him further as the temperature fluctuated wildly. One moment, the air was icy, his breath visible in pale clouds. The next, it was scorching, searing his lungs with each gasp. The smell of burning filled his nostrils, and he glanced down to see the floorboards charring beneath his feet, smoke curling upwards as flames licked at the edges of his vision. Desperation clawed at his mind. Was any of this real? He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to block out the cacophony of horrors assaulting his senses. But the harder he fought, the more intense the visions became. The hotel's sinister influence dug deeper, exploiting his deepest fears. He saw visions of being buried alive, the weight of the earth pressing down, robbing him of breath. He felt the crushing isolation of the endless desert, an expanse of nothingness stretching infinitely in all directions. A voice, deep and resonant, penetrated the chaos, a dark whisper that seemed to come from within his own mind. Why fight it, Marcos? Embrace the fear. Let it consume you. The temptation was insidious, a seductive pull promising an end to the torment if only he would surrender. His resistance wavered as exhaustion set in, both physical and mental. The allure of letting go, of allowing the darkness to envelop him, became increasingly appealing. Marcos sank to his knees, the sands of the desert now swirling around him within the corridor, forming a vortex of despair. The faces of the lost travelers circled him, chanting in an incomprehensible language, their voices melding into a hypnotic drone. The boundaries of his reality frayed further, and he felt himself teetering on the edge of oblivion. In a moment of clarity, he recalled the sacrifices he'd already made, the memory of his mother lost to the hotel's insatiable hunger. A spark of defiance ignited within him. He couldn't let the fear win. He wouldn't become another lost soul consumed by this accursed place. Gathering the remnants of his strength, Marcos forced himself to stand, the swirling sands pushing against him with tangible malice. "I am not yours to take," he shouted into the void, his voice echoing powerfully through the corridor. The faces recoiled, the whispers faltering. The oppressive weight pressing down on his mind lessened slightly, the vortex of sand slowing its furious spin. But the temptation lingered, the seductive promise of peace, if he would only relinquish his hold on reality. Marcos clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, the pain anchoring him to the moment. He began to push forward, each step a battle against the invisible forces trying to hold him back. The walls of the hotel groaned in protest, the very structure seeming to bend and warp in response to his defiance. As he pressed on, the hallucinations intensified in a final, desperate attempt to break his will. The floor beneath him cracked open, revealing a chasm filled with writhing shadows. From its depths, hands reached out, grasping at his ankles, their touch icy and numbing. The corridor behind him collapsed into darkness, leaving him no choice but to continue forward. Summoning every ounce of courage, Marcos leaped over the widening fissure, landing unsteadily on the other side. The path ahead was obscured by a thick fog, but a faint glimmer of light beckoned him. The whispers transformed into anguished wails, the hotel itself seeming to howl in rage as he broke free from its grasp. He sprinted toward the light, the shadows snapping at his heels, the walls closing in. Just as the darkness threatened to overtake him completely, he burst through a set of heavy doors, stumbling out into the cold night air. The oppressive atmosphere lifted instantly, the cacophony of voices silenced. Behind him, the hotel stood ominously silent, its windows dark, the structure appearing once again as an inert, lifeless building. Marcos collapsed onto the sand, gasping for breath, his mind reeling from the ordeal. The desert night was quiet, the stars above offering a stark contrast to the nightmare he had just endured. But even as he lay there, relief washing over him, a lingering doubt gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. Had he truly escaped, or was this yet another illusion crafted by the insidious forces within the hotel? He couldn't shake the feeling that reality had been irrevocably altered, his perceptions forever tainted by the terror he had faced. The temptation of fear had shown him the fragility of his own mind, leaving him to wonder if he would ever truly be free from the shadows that had sought to consume him. Marcos had barely caught his breath before the air around him shifted, turning cold and stale, like the remnants of a forgotten tomb. He was outside the hotel now, but something wasn't right. The vast desert stretched endlessly in all directions, yet it felt constrictive, oppressive. A thick fog rolled in, coiling around his legs like the fingers of unseen phantoms. The stars above, once bright and distant, dimmed until they vanished entirely, leaving him in a suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow both time and space. He felt an inexplicable tug in his chest, a pull he couldn't resist, like a dark thread binding him back to the hotel. It was as if he hadn't escaped at all, as if he'd been dragged to another layer of the nightmare, one that lay just outside the walls of that cursed place. He turned, and there, rising from the shadows, the hotel loomed taller, more menacing than before, its windows like hollow eyes staring deep into his soul. His instincts screamed at him to run, yet he felt rooted to the spot, compelled by an invisible force that wouldn't release its grip. A whisper floated through the fog, a voice he recognized, his mother's. But it was different, twisted, laced with something dark and insidious. "Come inside, Marcos," it coaxed, both soft and sharp, like a blade hidden in velvet. "You left something behind." The voice sent chills down his spine, stirring memories he'd thought buried forever. His mother's warnings about dark places, her tales of lost souls wandering in endless torment. Yet, this was no mere memory. It was a lure, a trap expertly woven from his fears and past. His heart pounded as he stepped forward, unable to resist the pull, feeling the ground beneath him soften, as though the desert itself sought to consume him. The sand shifted, swirling up to his knees, each grain heavy with the weight of countless forgotten lives. With each step, he felt his own mind fragmenting, pieces of himself peeling away, as if the very act of walking toward a hotel was unraveling him. His vision blurred, and in the haze, he saw shadows dancing in the fog, figures watching him, their faces empty, their eyes voids that drew him in. Just before he reached the entrance, the whisper ceased, replaced by a dead, ringing silence. Then, the doors swung open on their own, revealing a dimly lit hallway lined with cracked mirrors. The floor beneath him creaked as he stepped inside, each sound echoing louder than the last, as though mocking him. The air felt thick, almost alive, pressing against his skin. He could feel a presence, one that seemed to be everywhere at once, watching him from all angles, testing his resolve. As he walked deeper into the corridor, a shadow detached itself from the wall, slinking forward with a twisted elegance. It was a figure made of darkness, its form shifting and flickering, yet its eyes burned with a sinister intelligence. Marcos froze, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread as the shadow took shape, morphing into a creature with elongated limbs, fingers like claws that scraped along the walls, leaving dark, scorched trails in their wake. Its voice was a distorted echo, layered with malice, as it whispered, "You have come so far, Marcos. But what will you give to truly escape?" The entity's gaze seemed to pierce through him, rooting through his memories, his fears, his regrets. He felt exposed, his soul laid bare before this thing that embodied all the darkness he'd tried to leave behind. Marcos could barely breathe as the figure loomed over him, a malevolent grin twisting across its face. Then it spoke again, each word digging into his mind like a dagger. "You took a piece of this place with you. Now it wants something in return." The moment of truth hung in the air, a choice he hadn't anticipated. The entity leaned closer, and Marcos could feel the icy breath of the void it carried within. It showed him visions of a life free from terror, of memories untainted by the darkness he had endured. But he could sense the price behind those promises, a cost steep and insurmountable. To sever his connection to this nightmare, he would have to give up something irreplaceable, a sacrifice that would forever alter the fabric of who he was. "Give me your final memory of hope," the entity demanded, its voice a hollow, empty echo. "Surrender the last part of you that still believes in light, and you may walk free." The words struck Marcos with the force of a physical blow. He realized that the hotel and the things standing before him wanted not only his past, but his future. To leave, he would have to abandon the very thing that had driven him to survive, the faint, flickering belief that there was something better waiting for him beyond this nightmare. His mind raced, torn between his desperate desire to escape and the horror of losing the last piece of himself. He could feel his hopes slipping as the darkness around him pressed closer, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. But as he struggled, another thought emerged, a glimmer of resistance, a refusal to give in to the shadow's demands. His mother's words echoed faintly in his mind, words he had forgotten but that now returned like a lifeline. She had always told him, "As long as there's a shred of hope, you're never truly lost." The entity seemed to sense his resistance, its twisted grin fading into a look of rage, its form rippling with anger. The air grew colder, the lights dimming as the shadow loomed over him, darkness pooling around his feet, swallowing the light, as if it meant to devour him whole. Marcos took a step back, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. He wasn't going to give in, not this time. His heart raced, but something inside him held firm, a stubborn refusal to surrender the last piece of his soul. With a surge of defiance, he shouted, "You can't take what I choose to keep." His voice echoed through the hall, shattering the silence, sending ripples through the oppressive darkness. The shadow recoiled, its form distorting, as if his defiance had burned it, leaving scars across its twisted form. The walls around him trembled, the mirrors cracking, each shard reflecting a piece of his newfound strength, his refusal to give up the last fragment of his humanity. The shadow screeched, an unholy sound that rattled through the walls of the hotel, the ground quaking beneath his feet. It lunged, a desperate attempt to reclaim him, but Marcos stood his ground, his defiance a shield against its wrath. The hallway began to dissolve around him, the walls bleeding into darkness, the hotel's form unraveling as his strength pushed back against its influence. Then, with one final, furious wail, the shadow shattered, dissolving into wisps of smoke that were swallowed by the fog. The ground steadied, the oppressive weight lifted, and the dim light returned, casting the corridor in a ghostly, silent calm. Marcos took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of his own survival settle over him. He had faced his moment of truth, and though he had lost pieces of himself to this place, he had held onto the one thing that mattered most, his will to endure. As he stepped out of the hotel's shadow for the last time, the fog began to recede, revealing the vast desert stretching endlessly before him. The stars above blinked back into existence, their light fragile yet comforting, guiding him away from the nightmare that had nearly claimed him. Though he knew he would carry the scars of this encounter forever, he walked forward, his heart steady, his soul intact. Behind him, the hotel faded into darkness, a part of it lingering in his mind like a distant memory, a reminder of the night he defied the shadows and survived. Marcos could feel the weight of his journey pressing on him as he reached the heart of the hotel, a grand, decaying ballroom that seemed to defy logic, as if it were both nowhere and everywhere at once. The space was cavernous, lined with tall, ornate mirrors that stretched up to the arched ceiling, each one cracked and mottled with age, reflecting distorted fragments of himself in every direction. Dust floated through the air like ghostly fireflies, and the silence was so profound that it seemed to amplify his heartbeat, each pulse echoing against the vast emptiness. He felt drawn toward the center of the room, where a single chandelier hung, its crystals dulled and coated in grime, casting a faint, sickly yellow light that illuminated the shadows lurking in every corner. As he stepped further in, he realized that he was not alone. Shadows began to gather along the walls, silent and watchful, their forms flickering, taking on twisted human shapes. They were the souls of those who had come before him, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent, agonized screams. He could feel their despair, their longing for escape, and he knew that they, too, had faced the same terror that now awaited him. In the center of the ballroom, a figure materialized, a dark, shifting form cloaked in shadows, towering and faceless, its edges blurring as though it were made from the very darkness that enveloped the hotel. This was the heart of the entity, the force that had fed off the fears and memories of countless souls trapped within its walls. It exuded an aura of ancient malice, a hunger that pulsed in waves, making the air thick with the stench of decay and despair. The entity's gaze fell upon Marcos, even without eyes, its presence burrowing into his mind, tearing at his memories, his identity. It spoke in a voice that was both many in one, layered and distorted, filling his head with whispers of torment. "You came so far," it said, its tone mocking, yet cold as death itself. "But now you stand before me with nothing left to bargain. You're mine, Marcos." Just like all the others, Marcos felt an overwhelming urge to drop to his knees, to surrender himself to the crushing despair that radiated from the creature. Visions flooded his mind, images of himself wandering the hotel's endless halls for eternity, his face becoming as hollow and haunted as the souls that now surrounded him. He saw himself fading, losing all sense of who he was, becoming just another shadow bound to this place. The sheer terror of that fate made his body shake, and he had to fight the impulse to succumb, to give up the last shred of hope he clung to. The entity moved closer, each step echoing through the ballroom, its form shifting, growing darker and larger, until it towered over him, blocking out the dim light from the chandelier. Marcos felt trapped, his legs unable to move, as if the very floor were holding him in place. The figure reached out a hand, fingers long and skeletal, each one tipped with a claw that glinted like black glass. The touch of the claw was ice-cold as it traced down his cheek, and he felt as though it were reaching inside him, clawing at his very soul. But in that moment, a flicker of defiance ignited within him. He remembered the journey he had taken, the memories he had fought to protect, and the sacrifice he had made to survive this far. His mother's voice echoed faintly in his mind, her words a distant comfort, reminding him of who he was, of the strength he held within. He wouldn't let this creature take that from him. Not now. Not ever. With a surge of determination, Marcos reached into his pocket and grasped the keychain, the small, tarnished star his mother had given him as a child. It was all he had left, a symbol of everything he refused to surrender. As his fingers closed around it, he felt a warmth spread through him, a strength he hadn't realized he possessed. He held up, letting its faint gleam reflect in the cracked mirrors around him, casting small, fractured beams of light that pierced through the shadows. The entity recoiled, its form flickering, its power wavering as the light seemed to burn into it. A guttural, rage-filled growl echoed through the room, and the shadows around him shrieked, twisting and writhing as though in agony. The ballroom began to shudder, the walls cracking, pieces of the ceiling crumbling as the hotel itself seemed to react to his defiance. Marcos took a step forward, his fear replaced by a fierce resolve, his voice steady as he shouted into the darkness, "You will not take me." The entity howled, a sound that was neither human nor earthly, as it lashed out, its shadowy form stretching toward him, trying to smother the light. Marcos braced himself, clutching the keychain tighter, his mind filled with memories of his mother, his past, every piece of himself that the hotel had tried to strip away. He focused on those memories, letting them anchor him, refusing to let the darkness consume them. The chandelier above began to sway, casting beams of fractured light across the room, and for a brief moment, Marcos saw the true form of the entity, a grotesque, twisted mass of faces, each one distorted with terror and pain, merging and shifting within the darkness. They were the souls of those it had devoured, trapped within its endless hunger. Seeing this, Marcos felt a surge of pity mixed with his terror. These were once people, like him, who had fallen victim to the same nightmare. And now, he was the only one left to stand against it. Summoning every ounce of courage, he held the keychain high, its light intensifying, filling the room with a brilliant, blinding glow. The mirrors around him shattered one by one, each crack releasing an echo of a life once trapped within, voices crying out in gratitude, in freedom. The entity screeched, its form disintegrating, its power fracturing as the light tore through it, unraveling the darkness like threads of shadow pulled apart by an invisible hand. Marcos could feel the hotel collapsing around him, the very fabric of the place unraveling as the entity's hold over it weakened. The shadows retreated, dissolving into wisps of smoke, and the faces within the darkness faded, their tortured expressions giving way to peace as they were finally released. The entity let out one final, anguished cry, its form imploding, leaving nothing but a hollow echo that quickly faded into silence. The ballroom fell still, bathed in the soft, warm glow of the morning light filtering through cracks in the walls. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by a sense of calm, as though the hotel itself had been freed from its own curse. Marcos took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from his chest, a profound relief settling over him. He had faced the darkness, endured the terror, and emerged with his soul intact. As he stepped out of the ruins, the desert stretched out before him, vast and endless, but no longer menacing. The sky was painted with the colors of dawn, casting a golden glow across the sands. He looked down at the keychain in his hand, its metal warm, a reminder of everything he had fought for, everything he had reclaimed. With a final look back at the remnants of the hotel, Marcos walked forward, leaving behind the nightmare and carrying only the light within him. The desert was silent, peaceful, and he knew, in his heart, that he had broken free, not just from the hotel, but from the fear that had threatened to consume him. The shadows might remain, lurking somewhere beyond the horizon, but they no longer held power over him. He was free. The desert stretched infinitely before Marcos as he walked away from the ruined hotel, the silence of dawn settling like a blanket over the sands. The nightmare had ended, the shadows dissipated, and the malevolent entity that had haunted him was gone. Yet, as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, an unsettling feeling lingered within him, a nagging whisper in the back of his mind that told him he wasn't entirely free. He felt as though something had followed him, an invisible thread still connecting him to the place he had just escaped. Looking back, he saw only empty desert, the hotel now vanished, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. The sands appeared undisturbed, smooth as though freshly swept by an unseen hand. There was no sign of the ballroom, the shadowy figures, or the haunted halls he had just traversed. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. It was as if the hotel had been a mirage, something that existed only for those unfortunate enough to stumble upon it. His heart sank as he wondered if others would still find it, drawn to it by the same invisible lure that had nearly claimed him. He continued walking, the silence around him almost too perfect, pressing in on him with an unnatural weight. The sands shifted beneath his feet, and he could swear he heard faint whispers in the breeze, voices that sounded like echoes of the souls he had freed, or perhaps of those still trapped. Every now and then, he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the hotel reappear, looming like a dark wound against the endless desert. But each time, there was nothing, only the emptiness of the sands and the feeling of being watched. As he moved further from where the hotel had once stood, Marcos noticed something strange. The keychain he still held in his hand, the small star his mother had given him, felt oddly warm, almost pulsing with a faint rhythm, like a heartbeat. It was comforting, yet eerie, a reminder of the horrors he had faced and the memory he had clung to. But now, as he examined it closely, he saw something he hadn't noticed before, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack running along its surface, as if it, too, had been affected by the malevolent force he had confronted. He closed his hand around the keychain, but the warmth didn't fade. In fact, it grew stronger, seeping into his skin, a tingling sensation that crawled up his arm. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over him, and he staggered, his vision blurring as flashes of the hotel filled his mind. The flickering chandelier, the twisted faces in the mirrors, the skeletal fingers of the entity reaching for him. He shook his head, trying to dispel the images, but they lingered, as though the memories were branded into his mind, a permanent scar left by the darkness he had escaped. A chill settled over him as he realized that perhaps he hadn't left the hotel entirely behind. The shadow might have been vanquished, but its presence seemed to linger within him, woven into his memories, an indelible part of his past. He could feel it, a dark seed planted deep in his mind, waiting, watching, as if it might one day awaken and reclaim him. The thought filled him with a quiet dread, a fear that he would never be truly free. Marcos continued walking, his footsteps slow, weighed down by the uncertainty that gnawed at him. As he reached a rise in the desert, he stopped, gazing out over the sands, hoping to see a sign of civilization, a road, anything that would ground him back in reality. But instead, he was met with the stark emptiness of the desert, stretching endlessly, a barren expanse that seemed to mock his sense of direction. The landscape was silent, too silent, and he felt a strange pull to turn around, to go back, as though an invisible thread were tugging him toward the place he had just left. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, but the silence only deepened, pressing in on him with an unnatural intensity. And then, just as he was about to open his eyes, he heard it, a faint melody drifting through the air, hauntingly familiar. His mother's lullaby, twisted and warped, echoing as if carried by the desert wind. His heart skipped a beat, and a cold sweat broke out across his skin. He opened his eyes, scanning the horizon, but there was no one there, only the empty sands stretching before him. The lullaby grew louder, filling his ears, and he felt an overwhelming urge to turn back, to return to the hotel that no longer existed. It was as if the song were a siren call, luring him back into the depths of the nightmare he thought he had escaped. His mind raced, fighting the pull, but the melody persisted, weaving through his thoughts, planting seeds of doubt. Had he truly escaped, or was this another layer of the nightmare, a trick to make him believe he was free only to pull him back at the last moment? He shook his head, clinging to the warmth of the sun on his skin, the feel of the sand beneath his feet, grounding himself in reality. Yet as he walked, he could feel the shadows creeping at the edges of his vision, flickering in the corners of his mind, waiting. The lullaby faded, but the silence that followed felt heavy, as if it were holding its breath, biding its time. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him, something that would wait patiently, lurking in the darkness of his mind until the moment was right to return. As he took one final look back, the sands seemed to shift, and for the briefest moment, he saw the outline of the hotel on the horizon, a dark silhouette against the dawn. He blinked, and it was gone, but the image lingered, seared into his mind. He knew deep down that the hotel was still out there, waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon it, to become ensnared in its twisted corridors and endless shadows. And as he turned away, heading toward an uncertain future, he couldn't escape the feeling that a part of him remained trapped within those walls, a fragment of his soul lost to the darkness. The hotel had left its mark on him, a scar that would never fade, a memory that would haunt him like a shadow, forever reminding him of the terror he had faced, and the mystery that would always remain.